hopefully you can see this well. Now that I've finished the hood, even though the hood parts were made exactly the same, by the time you finish sewing them, the edges don't all stay together perfectly. So before you pin it to the body, it's good to just look it over. This edge is actually really close. It's almost exact. But this edge, you have two pieces of fabric here and they're not matching perfectly. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to trim it to where they match perfectly. Now, the reason to do that is because when we're pinning this together, we're pinning the body to these two pieces of fabric. And then we're going to sew all three pieces of fabric together. And it's very difficult to make sure that you have sewn all three pieces of fabric if some pieces of the fabric are longer than others. As you're pinning, now that it's the real deal, we're going to sew this together. It's very important that you pin frequently because you're going around a circle. So about every inch and a half, you're going to pin it together. And very important that you make sure that all your edges are together, all three. Now, once I've gone almost halfway around, I'm almost to the middle, I now flip my hood this way. So I do it this way because once I put my hood on the wrong side out, okay? I put it on basically backwards. So I start it this way, putting the right side to the right side, in the middle there, get part way around, and then I flip it and do the rest. So then once I flip it out, I can go back to the front and start going around the other side. Same way. Pinning about every inch and a half. Keeping all three pieces of fabric together and nice and flat. Here we are to the end. I'm going to pin that little corner to the end, to the middle of the back. And I'm going to take this little extra from the hood, fold it over to create a little pleat. Same thing on the other side. And for whatever reason, my pleats are not uniform. Close enough to the back there that it's more important to me that these pleats be uniform. So I'm going to eyeball it this way. What I have is I have this section coming up a little bit, so it's not matching that part perfectly. So I'm going to trim it to where it matches the body, to where it goes down right alongside the body. It doesn't really matter where you start because you're pinned. The important thing is that if you are not careful, just like when you were adding the cuffs to the sleeve, if you're not careful, you're going to be sewing on top of things that you don't want to sew. So you've got to make sure as you're going around that you only have the part of the fabric that you want to sew underneath your foot and your needle. So I'm going to go here again. We want a nice seam size. So I'm pushing my needle all the way to the left and I'm using my foot as my guide. I'm going to go backwards and forwards. This is going to be a long little way around because I want to make sure that I'm only sewing the parts of the fabric that I want to sew. And just as when you were working on the cuff, you have a lot of needles poking out at you, similar situation here. You're going to get poked a lot if you're not careful. There's a saying called haste makes waste. And when you rush through this part is when you end up doing things where you end up having to pick out a whole bunch of stitches because you've somehow stitched parts of the hood together that you didn't mean to stitch. So as you make sure that your fabric is staying away and you're only stitching on what you mean to stitch. Always ending by going backwards. Get that stitch in really well. Off those threads. And now for the moment of truth. Turn it around. Go over every part of your seams. Make sure you didn't sew part of the hood that you didn't mean to sew. You can see right here this little section, that little pleat. Not a bad thing, that was meant to be there. Now the last thing we could do, if we felt like it, is we could add trim to the cuff. In this case, I'm not going to add trim to the cuff. This is a light trim, and if you look at my cuffs, every time the cuffs are what gets really dirty for me. So this was a little bit darker trim. It's not as visible, but I know if I put this lavender trim on my cuff, it's going to be disgusting very quickly. Whereas this fabric is going to hide all my stains. Okay, this is the final product. This is an easy bias tape trim with a rounded bottom. Quilt binding on the bottom. You can also do just the double-sided binding on the bottom instead of the quilt binding. Oh, with the hood up.